In the bustling streets of Atlanta, where the summer heat painted the sidewalks with shimmering mirages, Sarah Mitchell was running late for her evening shift at Memorial Hospital. As a nurse practitioner with 10 years of experience, tardiness wasn't in her nature. But today, fate had other plans. The sight of an elderly man struggling with grocery bags outside the local supermarket made her foot instinctively ease off the gas pedal. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. Kindness doesn't cost a thing, baby girl. Through her car window she could see him wobbling, his weathered hands trembling under the weight of the brown paper bags. Something in her heart tugged. She couldn't just drive past. Sarah pulled into the nearest parking spot, her scrubs rustling as she hurried over to help. "Sir, please let me give you a hand with those," she called out, her voice carrying that warm Southern comfort her patients always appreciated. The elderly gentleman, probably in his early 80s, turned to her with surprised blue eyes, his white hair neatly combed despite the sweat beading on his forehead. "Oh, thank you, dear, but I wouldn't want to trouble you," he responded with a gentle smile that reminded her of her late grandfather. His clothes, though simple, khaki pants and a light blue button-down shirt, spoke of dignity maintained through the years. "It's no trouble at all," Sarah insisted, already reaching for the heavier bags. "My car's right here. I can drive you home if you like." She surprised herself with the offer. Her shift started in 20 minutes, but something about this man's presence made her want to ensure he got home safely. During the short drive to his modest house in the old part of town, they shared comfortable conversation. He introduced himself simply as Robert, and his stories about the neighborhood's history fascinated her. He spoke of civil rights marches that had passed through these very streets, of communities coming together despite their differences, of hope blooming in unlikely places. What Sarah didn't know then was that this chance encounter would change her life forever. As she helped Robert carry his groceries into his home, her eyes caught glimpses of photographs on the walls, images that made her heart skip a beat. Among them was a faded black and white photograph that seemed strangely familiar, one she'd seen in history books and documentaries. Robert noticed her gaze lingering on the photographs. A knowing look crossed his face as he placed his keys on the kitchen counter. "There's something I should tell you, Sarah," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight she hadn't noticed before. "I'm not just any retired old-timer." The evening sun streamed through his kitchen window, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors. Sarah stood there, grocery bags still in hand, as Robert reached for an old leather wallet. Inside was a worn card that made her breath catch in her throat. In that moment, she realized she wasn't just helping any elderly man with his groceries. She was standing in the presence of someone who had shaped American history, someone whose name had been in textbooks she'd studied in school. The revelation left her speechless, the weight of the moment pressing against her chest. Her simple act of kindness had led her to cross paths with a living legend, though she had yet to understand the full magnitude of who Robert really was. Now running properly late for her shift, Sarah found herself rooted to the spot, torn between her professional obligations and the extraordinary story unfolding before her. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of an incredible journey that would remind her, and eventually thousands of others, that sometimes the most remarkable stories begin with the simplest acts of kindness. The card in Robert's wallet was a faded membership badge from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, dated 1963. Sarah's hands trembled as she realized she was standing before someone who had walked alongside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. during one of the most pivotal moments in American history. The badge bore witness to countless meetings, marches, and moments that had shaped the nation's conscience. "I was just a young man then," Robert said, lowering himself into a kitchen chair. "Nobody special, just someone who believed we could make things better." His humility only made the revelation more powerful. Sarah called her supervisor at the hospital, explaining she'd be late for her shift. Some moments in life demanded pause, and this was one of them. As Robert brewed them both cups of tea, his hands still steady despite his age, he began sharing stories that seemed to breathe life into the black and white photographs on his walls. He spoke of tense nights planning peaceful protests, of songs that carried hope through dark times, and of unlikely friendships that bloomed in the face of adversity. "But that's not why I showed you this," he said, gesturing to the badge. "I recognized something in you today, Sarah. The same thing I saw in so many young people back then. A willingness to stop and help, even when it's inconvenient. That's how real change happens, one small action at a time." Sarah wrapped her hands around the warm teacup, absorbing every word. Her eyes drifted to a particular photograph on the wall, one showing a group of young protesters, both black and white, sharing a meal together. Robert followed her gaze and smiled, a mix of joy and sadness crossing his face. "That photo was taken at a secret meeting place," he explained. "We called it the Unity Kitchen. It was in the basement of a church, where people from all walks of life could come together safely. The woman who ran it—" He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "Well, that's another story altogether, and it's connected to why I've been wanting to find someone like you." Sarah leaned forward, curiosity burning in her chest. Robert stood up slowly, making his way to an old roll-top desk in the corner of the room. From a drawer, he pulled out a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. "I've been carrying a promise for over 50 years," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A promise I made to someone very special, someone who saved my life during those troubled times." The envelope trembled slightly in his weathered hands as he returned to the table. "You see, Sarah, your kindness today wasn't just about helping an old man with his groceries. It was about showing me that the right person finally came along. Someone who could help me fulfill this promise." Sarah's heart raced as Robert placed the envelope on the table between them. The name written on it was faded but still legible. "To be opened by a person of true kindness, when the time is right." The handwriting was elegant, yet somehow urgent, as if the words had been written in a hurry. "Before I tell you what's in this envelope," Robert said, his blue eyes suddenly intense, "you need to understand the full story of the Unity Kitchen and the remarkable woman who brought hope to so many during those dangerous days. But I have to warn you, once you know, there's no going back. This isn't just history, Sarah. What's in this envelope? It could change things even today." The kitchen clock ticked steadily in the background, marking each moment of silence that followed his words. Sarah's shift at the hospital seemed a lifetime away now, as she sat on the precipice of what felt like a momentous decision. The envelope lay between them, a bridge between past and present, holding secrets that had waited half a century to be revealed. Robert's hands shook slightly as he began to unfold the story of the Unity Kitchen. Back in '63, it wasn't just a place to eat, he explained, his voice growing stronger with each word. It was a sanctuary run by a remarkable woman named Rose Thompson. She didn't just feed people's bodies, she fed their hopes, their dreams of a better tomorrow. Sarah noticed how his eyes lit up at the mention of Rose's name. He reached for an old photo album, its leather cover cracked with age. Inside was a photograph of a young black woman in her 30s, her smile radiating warmth even through the faded image. She stood proudly in front of a simple kitchen, surrounded by people of all races sharing a meal together. "Rose had this way about her," Robert continued, gently touching the photograph. "She could diffuse the most tense situations with just a few words and a plate of her famous cornbread. That kitchen saved more lives than anyone will ever know." He paused, collecting his thoughts. But what most people never knew was that Rose was also keeping detailed records, documents that proved how local officials were secretly funding segregationist groups. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as Robert revealed how Rose had discovered these connections while cleaning the offices of prominent city leaders. "She kept everything hidden in a special place," he said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "The night she told me about it was the same night we learned someone had discovered what she knew." The tension in the room grew thick as Robert described the events of that fateful evening. Rose knew they were coming for her and the documents. She had minutes to act. He stopped, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "That's when she made me promise. A promise that's haunted me for 50 years. Sarah's heart pounded as Robert turned the sealed envelope over in his hands. "She made me swear to keep this safe until I found someone who showed the same spirit of kindness she did. Someone who would know exactly what to do with what's inside." His eyes met Sarah's with an intensity that made her shiver. The night she gave me this envelope was the last time anyone ever saw Rose Thompson." The weight of history pressed down on Sarah's shoulders as Robert continued. "The official story was that she left town, but those of us who knew her," his voice cracked with emotion, "we knew Rose would never abandon the Unity kitchen, not willingly." As the evening shadows lengthened across the kitchen floor, Robert revealed how the documents Rose had collected disappeared along with her. "But she was always 3 steps ahead," he said, a hint of pride breaking through his sadness. "Rose had a plan, and part of that plan is in this envelope. The other part," he gestured to another photograph, this one showing the old church where the Unity kitchen had been located. "The church is still standing," Robert said, his voice gaining urgency. "And if what Rose told me is true, there's something hidden there that could finally bring the truth to light. But we're not the only ones who've been waiting all these years. Last week, I spotted someone taking pictures of the old church, someone who looked very interested in its basement." Sarah leaned forward, her earlier thoughts of her hospital shift completely forgotten. The envelope between them seemed to pulse with 50 years of secrets, and somewhere in the city, an old church basement potentially held answers that powerful people had tried to bury for half a century. "Before I opened this envelope, Sarah," Robert said, his voice heavy with the weight of history, "you need to understand. What Rose left behind could change more than just history. There are people in this city, people with famous names and tall buildings, who would prefer these secrets stay buried in that church basement." With trembling fingers, Robert finally opened the envelope. Inside was a single yellowed page of paper and what looked like an old key. As he unfolded the paper, something else fluttered to the table. A black and white photograph Sarah hadn't seen before. It showed Rose standing next to a much younger Robert. But there was a third person in the photo that made Sarah's heart skip a beat. That's my grandmother," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. The same warm smile she remembered from her childhood was captured perfectly in the faded photograph, her grandmother's arm linked with Rose's in a gesture of friendship. "But she never told me. She never said anything about the Unity kitchen." Robert's eyes widened with sudden recognition. "Catherine Mitchell," he breathed. "Of course, I should have known when I heard your last name. Your grandmother wasn't just Rose's friend. She was her partner in everything they did. They worked together, documenting everything." His voice grew urgent. "Sarah, this isn't just about fulfilling a promise anymore. You have a right to know. Your grandmother was there the night Rose disappeared." Sarah's world tilted on its axis as Robert unfolded Rose's letter. But before he could read it, his security system chimed. Someone was at the front door. Through the window, they could see a sleek black car parked across the street, its engine still running. Robert quickly refolded the letter, his movements suddenly precise and deliberate. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Those men I saw at the church last week, they must have followed me home from the grocery store. They've been watching, waiting to see if I would ever share these secrets with anyone." He pressed the letter and key into Sarah's hands. "Your grandmother knew this day might come. That's why Rose chose to hide everything in plain sight." As footsteps approached the front porch, Robert led Sarah through his kitchen to a back door. "The truth isn't just in those documents," he whispered. "It's in the walls of that old church, and the recipes Rose left behind, and the coded messages your grandmother helped create. They used the Unity Kitchen's weekly menus to pass information, hiding messages in plain sight that only they could understand." The sound of knocking echoed through the house. "Go," Robert urged, pressing a small notebook into her hands along with the envelope. "Everything you need to know is in Rose's old recipe book. Your grandmother helped write it. She'd want you to finish what they started." His eyes met hers with fierce determination. "But Sarah, be careful. The people involved in this, some of them are still in power today." Sarah clutched the envelope and notebook, her mind racing. "But what about you? I can't just leave you here." Robert's smile was gentle but firm. "I've been preparing for this moment for 50 years. Trust me, I know how to handle them." He gestured to a side gate. "There's a community garden 2 blocks south. Cut through there. They won't follow you without drawing attention." As Sarah slipped away into the gathering dusk, she could hear Robert's voice greeting someone at his front door, calm, and pleasant as ever. Her grandmother's face in that photograph burned in her memory as she moved quickly through the quiet streets. All those stories her grandmother had told her about standing up for what's right, about how real change happens in quiet moments of courage. They weren't just lessons. They were clues, breadcrumbs leading to this very moment. The recipe book in her hands suddenly felt heavier with purpose. Somewhere in its pages, between measurements and cooking times, lay encoded truths that had waited 50 years to be revealed. And now, just like the women who had come before her, Sarah found herself running through the gathering darkness, carrying secrets that could shake the very foundations of her city. Sarah's heart pounded as she sat in her car outside the old church, Rose's recipe book open on her lap under the dim streetlight. After 3 sleepless nights of decoding the recipes, she'd finally understood. Each measurement, each cooking time was part of a complex cipher. 2 cups of flour, bake at 350, wasn't just a recipe for cornbread. It was coordinates within the church's basement. Her phone buzzed. A text from Robert. He was safe, having convinced the men at his house that he was just a chatty old man with nothing to hide. But his message was clear. They're watching the church. Be careful. Your grandmother knew this day would come. Taking a deep breath, Sarah slipped through the side door using the key from the envelope. The church's current pastor, an elderly woman who'd known Rose, had agreed to help after Sarah shared her grandmother's photograph. The basement was exactly as Rose's notes described, right down to the crack in the 3rd tile from the left wall. With trembling fingers, Sarah pushed against the loose tile. It gave way, revealing a small cavity containing a metal box, sealed and untouched for 50 years. Inside were the documents Rose had hidden: property deeds, bank statements, and letters proving how city officials had secretly seized land from black families during urban renewal projects, all while profiting from backdoor deals with development companies. But there was something else, something that made Sarah's breath catch. A sealed letter addressed to her grandmother, dated the night Rose disappeared. As she opened it, a small key fell out, one that matched the antique lock on a filing cabinet still standing in the corner of the basement. The cabinet's drawer creaked open, revealing hundreds of photographs and detailed records. Rose hadn't just documented the illegal land deals. She'd been building a case to help families reclaim their stolen property. And there, in her grandmother's handwriting, was a list of every family affected, along with their descendants' names and current addresses. Footsteps above made Sarah freeze. The pastor's urgent whisper came through her phone. Someone's here, men in suits. They're asking about basement access. Sarah quickly photographed every document with her phone, her hands steady despite her racing heart. Just as voices approached the basement door, she replaced the box and tile. But as she turned to leave, something caught her eye. A small note tucked into the recipe book's binding, in her grandmother's handwriting. The real legacy isn't in these papers. It's in the lives we touched. Look behind the Unity Kitchen's old stove. Sarah's phone buzzed again. Robert had sent a photo. It showed the Unity Kitchen's original stove, preserved in the City Museum's Civil Rights exhibit. And there, barely visible in the photo's corner, was a young museum curator Sarah recognized instantly, her own daughter, who'd started working there just last month. The pieces suddenly fell together. Her grandmother and Rose hadn't just preserved evidence. They'd placed their hope for justice in the next generation. The museum exhibit, her daughter's position there, even Sarah's chance meeting with Robert. It wasn't chance at all. They'd laid this path decades ago, trusting that when the right time came, their grandchildren would find each other and finish what they started. As Sarah slipped out of the basement, clutching the evidence that would finally bring justice to hundreds of families, she smiled through her tears. Rose Thompson hadn't disappeared that night 50 years ago. She'd simply found a different way to win. Through recipes, photographs, and careful planning, she'd ensured that the truth would emerge when the next generation was ready to stand up for what's right. The morning news would soon carry the story of how a nurse's simple act of kindness revealed one of the city's biggest civil rights conspiracies. But more importantly, it would tell the story of how 3 generations of strong women, Rose, Catherine, and now Sarah, had worked across time itself to prove that justice, like the best recipes, is worth waiting for. As Sarah drove home in the dawning light, she made one last stop at her daughter's apartment. It was time to share another family story, one that would remind them both that the most powerful changes often start with the simplest acts of kindness. 1 month after that fateful night, Sarah stood in the renovated Unity kitchen, now transformed into a community center. The walls displayed the photographs she discovered, telling the story of Rose Thompson and the countless lives she touched. Her daughter Rachel, the museum curator, had helped create a permanent exhibition that ensured these stories would never be forgotten. The evidence Sarah uncovered had sent shockwaves through the city. Several prominent families had quietly settled with the descendants of those whose land had been stolen, while others faced legal consequences for their predecessors' actions. But more importantly, the Unity Kitchen was serving its original purpose once again, bringing people together, healing old wounds, and building bridges across generations. Robert attended every community gathering, his eyes twinkling as he watched young people learn about their history while sharing meals at the same tables where Rose had once served hope by the plateful. He'd become a regular storyteller, sharing first-hand accounts of the civil rights movement with school groups and ensuring that the next generation understood the power of everyday courage. Sarah's grandmother's recipe book had found a special place in the exhibition, its pages carefully preserved behind glass. But the recipes themselves lived on, with local families contributing their own stories and dishes to a new community cookbook. Each recipe now came with a story, weaving together the past and present in a tapestry of shared experiences. The most touching moment came when former Unity Kitchen regulars, now in their 80s and 90s, gathered for a reunion. They brought their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, sharing memories of how Rose's kindness had given them strength during the darkest days of segregation. Sarah watched as they traced their fingers over the photographs, tears mixing with laughter as they remembered the woman who had risked everything to protect their futures. Rachel had discovered something else in her research. Rose Thompson hadn't disappeared that night 50 years ago. She'd gone into hiding with the help of a network of supporters, continuing her work quietly from the shadows. She lived out her days in a small town 2 states away, passing away peacefully in 1989, knowing that someday, when the time was right, the truth would emerge. The old church's basement had been preserved as a historical site, with tours now showing visitors the hidden tile where the evidence had waited so patiently. But the real legacy wasn't in the documents or the building. It was in the lives that continued to be changed by Rose's example. Sarah often found herself sitting in the renovated kitchen, watching as people from all walks of life shared meals and stories together. She'd framed the moment when she'd stopped to help Robert with his groceries, marveling at how a simple act of kindness had unlocked a story 50 years in the making. One evening, as the community center was closing, Sarah discovered a young girl trying to recreate one of Rose's recipes. The girl explained that she was doing a school project on everyday heroes, and Rose's story had inspired her. Sarah smiled, remembering her own grandmother's words about how real change happens in quiet moments of courage. As she helped the girl measure ingredients, Sarah realized that this was the true power of Rose and Catherine's legacy, not just in exposing past wrongs, but in inspiring future generations to carry forward the simple, profound truth that had started it all. Kindness, like bread shared among strangers, has the power to sustain us through the darkest times and lead us toward a brighter tomorrow. And so, the Unity Kitchen continues its mission, not just as a place of history, but as a living testament to the enduring power of compassion, courage, and the simple act of stopping to help someone in need. After all, as Rose Thompson always said, the best recipes aren't just about the ingredients. They're about the love we stir into them.